thank you so much for, agreeing to do this podcast. I'm so excited about our conversation. So we're just going to jump right into it. So you were born and raised in a not so diverse corner of Connecticut. Can you talk about how it was growing up there? Who'd you idolize growing up?
Sure. I mean, I am from a small town in southeastern Connecticut called Norwich, and if you're on the Northeast Corridor Amtrak, it's close to the New London stop. And actually, I was just there this weekend. I realized that I'm super New England. As soon as we crossed the border, I was like, wow, this feels very, very home-like. So I'm a New Englander, and I did grow up in a small town that wasn't very diverse, that most of the black people there I was related to, and which was comforting in a way, right? And my family has been there for a very, very long time. So my family is a combination of African American people, Native American people, and Portuguese folks from Cape Verde, which is a very popular, I don't know about that, but it is a common combination on the coast of New England. So that's my family. Growing up there was both, I think it was I had a great childhood. It was very, very good in terms of it being a kind of nurturing place. I think part of it was that my family's been there for so long that we were the kind of known non-white quantity. So that we are very much a part of that community, right? The difficult part was always for me, and when I was growing up, was thinking about kind of other examples of, or thinking about my relationship to other examples of black people and blackness, right? I grew up in I'm born in 1970, so I grew up, my kind of teenage moment was between, kind of 78 and, 89, right? And that's an incredible moment in black history, right? Mm-hmm. In terms of thinking about the rise of hip hop, in terms of thinking about like a greater national understanding of what it means to be kind of an urban black person, right, which is related to hip hop, but also had other kind of consequences after the civil rights and Black Power movement. It was Reagan, right? So there was certain kinds of conversations about blackness and black people going on that were both like, from an incredibly conservative kind of like, demonizing of a kind of welfare queen idea, right? Mm-hmm. That were in contrast, right, to what I saw happening with early hip hop, which is about kind of a celebration, right, of black resilience, of irony, of black culture, right, that coming out of the civil rights and Black Power movements, right, and out of disco and funk, right. So there was this really, for me, a really kind of confusing and interesting mix happening there. So I was always trying to think about, well, I'm certainly not in any kind of inner city situation, right? I'm also not, kind of vibing on a Reagan idea, right, of what black people and blackness is about, right? So I feel like my teenage moment was one of like where I was, like many people, like super interested in any black thing that was happening on MTV, because MTV also came during that time, right? I was just like, what? This is a whole window onto a blackness, right? That wasn't necessarily my own, but I understood it as part of my larger culture, right? And then also trying to figure out like how that fit into my kind of really more specific, coastal New England blackness, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, it was an interesting time. I mean, the thing that I'm grateful for is that the community that I was in kind of allowed for that exploration, right? So, one day I might be, if I take it in a fashion direction, one day I might be kind of dressed as a kind of ironic version of the Preppy Handbook. The other day, the next day I could be like a punk or a goth. I went through all of these periods, and it was totally fine, right? My own experimentation and the experimentation of the kids around me wasn't something that it was accepted. So I felt like that part was really good.
So let's talk about some of your idols. I've heard you mention David Bowie, Jean Michel Basquiat, Patrick Kelly.
Yes.
Who'd you idolize?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, in terms of my search for, kind of blacknesses, like I was really interested in blacknesses, right? I wanted to sort of think about the kind of varieties and the different ways in blackness, the different ways in which people inhabit their blackness or embody it. Right? I think that I was interested in that, even though I wouldn't have put it that way at the time. I was interested in that from a really early age because I understood that I was not the typical black person, right? Although I was and I wasn't, right? I mean, I come from a black family, right, who understands itself as very black, right? But on the other hand, my circumstances or social circumstances or, geographical location or whatever were really different from how people saw, how the larger culture saw blackness. So I was always really interested in people who seemed to be otherwise, right? So that's why Basquiat was really important for me when, I tell the story about there was a picture of him in my local newspaper, which still makes no sense to me. Like, I don't remember. I want to go back and find out, like, what the article was about. Because, I mean, it had no relevance to, it must have been something like New York or, I don't know what it was about. But there was a picture of him, and I cut it out because I was like, who is this man? Right? Just totally being himself, totally being, like, he was so 80s, right? So it was just like this embodiment of, like a mix of black cultures, right? Some signifying on whiteness, right? I mean, I just felt like, wow, this man is telling me something I want to know more about, right? David Bowie was the same way. I mean, mostly in terms of, his gender presentation, right? I was just sort of like, one thing that a good friend of mine who grew up, a mixed-race woman who grew up in Sweden in the 60s, right? She was saying that she didn't have really any good examples of what it meant to be a black woman. So she often felt like she herself realized that she started kind of dressing and behaving more like a man, right? So there was a way in which, like, she couldn't occupy this space of black femininity, so she started playing with, at best, androgyny, but she was really interested in kind of masculinity at a certain point. And I felt like David Bowie, because my blackness wasn't something that was really, that I was thinking about, right? I felt like David Bowie's gender play was, like, the form of it was really fascinating to me, because I felt like, one of the things I talk about in my book, which we'll get to later, right, is the way in which instability crosses modes of identity, right? So once the blackness is in question, then the gender's in question, then the sexuality is in question, right? Then class can be in question. Like, one thing is off, the whole thing starts to shake, right? And I identified with Bowie in that way, right? Also, just like the boldness of his costuming was just, I mean, I don't have to say much about that. I don't have to say much about it. I mean, I was just sort of like, wow, and this was even before he was with Iman, right? So it was sort of like, I mean, I understood there was something about the way that he was working with clothing and identity that I recognized almost as kind of like almost black adjacent, right? I felt that and really admired him for that, or just was interested in where that was going to go, right? And Patrick Kelly was the same. Like, I mean, when I saw Patrick Kelly, I mean, again, Elle magazine it was. It was Elle magazine. And I was like, wow. Like, look at this guy who's showing up in Elle magazine in overalls, right? And he's selling this clothing that just seems really available to everyone, right? When he was doing the tube dresses, I was like, that seems like exactly the way things should be, right? That anybody, right, can be in this clothing, and it's really, it's colorful, it's fun, it's about celebrating life, it's not about like what you can't fit into, right? And it wasn't about what's not for you, right? It felt like much more of a situation where he was sort of saying, we can all, I want to create something that we can all get inside of, right? And that felt really important to me too, in terms of trying to think about a world like through an aesthetic, right, that had a kind of high level of inclusivity to it, right, where blacknesses was not a problem, neither was genders, right? So I was really, now I realize that I was interested in that. I would not, again, have articulated that way at 17.
So can we jump from the 17-year-old
Yeah.
Monica to
Please.
to the PhD student,
yes,
Monica, and talk about how you discovered your first project.
Yeah. My project on dandyism came out of a failed project on politics, right? So I had been deeply reading W.E.B. Du Bois, and which really I realize now was a real gift. I had been in a class with Cornell West where we were reading The Souls of Black Folk kind of word by word, and talking about Du Bois's influence on Black culture really specifically. And we were encouraged during that class to just kind of read Du Bois very, very widely. We were concentrating on The Souls of Black Folk, but everybody was encouraged to start reading other things. And because I was in a literature program, I started reading his novels, which are not good. But what they were, right, was this really interesting, kind of fascinating and totally engaged attempt to write politics into the kind of novel form in a way that, in a way that, I mean, he doesn't do it very well. It's very clunky, right? But I appreciated the way in which he tried over the course of, he wrote probably 5 or 6 novels, the way in which he tried to make that happen. He was sort of like, I think there's a way, like the politics that I'm interested in, the politics of inclusion, of like global color line politics, of kind of, at that point, even a kind of, socialism, and he's like, I can advance this stuff every day in my essays, but what if I tried to put it into imaginative literature, right, where there's not just a kind of moral values there, but there's a kind of intimacy amongst character, right, where those things can really be fleshed out. Like, I appreciated that effort. So Du Bois, I was reading those Du Bois novels, and I thought, well, let me just I'm going to write a dissertation on the political novel in the African American tradition, right? So then I started reading more, and the novels, the rest of them were also terrible, right? So I was like, I don't think I can. I was like, I can't do this because it's just not. It was mostly about failure, which I now realize would have been great, and that would have been a great alternative project, but I couldn't see that at the time. So I was like, I have to do something else here. And then I was reading some articles about Du Bois that talked about him specifically, right, as was really troubled about the fact that he had been caricatured as a dandy. And I was like, why? All the pictures or the portraits or representations I had seen of him were of him, wearing a kind of nice suit, right? And I thought, okay, well, that's normal Black man behavior, right? So I didn't get it, right? Or why it would be a problem, right? Or what the dandy accusation, right, would have meant. So then I started researching that, and I was like, oh, I get it, right? Because this dandy figure in this racialized dandy figure, right? So a dandy who is Black, right, has a really specific resonance, right, for Du Bois in the period after blackface minstrelsy, right? And I was like, oh, and then I got it, and then I thought, oh, well, this is interesting because the reading that I had been doing in the larger African American canon was showing me dandies everywhere, right? And not just in blackface, right? They were Black people who were choosing to dress and style themselves, dress and style and behave, right, in ways that were counter to expectation, right? Sometimes for their own benefit, right? And sometimes as a kind of ironic gesture, right, that was about like totally bucking the system. So then I realized that if you looked for it, it was everywhere. And I said, oh, this is what I want to write about. Like, how do Black people use fashion, dress, and style, right, to talk about themselves, right, to have an internal conversation, right, an intra-Black conversation, as well as, like, constantly be signaling, right, to a larger white majority. Like, how are they using that to talk about their own politics? How are they using that to talk about their kind of aesthetic desires? How are they using that to talk about, the ways in which they want to be seen and represented, right? So then I realized that there was something in that hadn't been explored before, in a long historical way, but also that was opening up texts for me in a way that I hadn't seen them before. So then I got excited about that.
So now we're going to jump from PhD student Monica to professor at Barnard Monica. And when you were here, you met your husband, who's Swedish, and you started going to Sweden, and it sort of shaped your newest project, which is about Black Swedish identities.
Exactly. So I spend a lot of time in Sweden. We're there in the summers and during sabbaticals and time off, and it's different from New York, you know, in kind of great ways and other ways. So one of the things that I became interested naturally in as I've been traveling back and forth was, and I was completing my first book during the first kind of 6-7 years that we were going back and forth, right? So I was really thinking I would be doing my work on African American kind of identity and culture, right? Sitting in you know, cafes and libraries in Stockholm, right? And often, you know, would often be asked about the project that I was working on and try to explain, you know, how I was thinking about race and blackness and things like that. And I found those conversations to be kind of fascinating because of the ways in which I learned eventually, right, to the ways in which I would have to explain, right? Because race and blackness and difference and kind of cultural, like Black cultural consciousness, right, are ideas that are not, at least at that time, they are now more. They were ideas that were just kind of not in a kind of Swedish rhetoric, right? A mainstream Swedish rhetoric. So I was like, oh, that's interesting to me, right? And also I was just noticing the way that demographically Sweden was changing in the times that I was going there. I have this joke where my husband was like, oh, we have Black people in Sweden, right? I was like, really? Right? And the first summer that we were there, I saw the same Black people, right? I mean, so the city empties out in July, and he was like, look, here are these Black people in the city. And I was like, we saw them 2 days ago. So I was not convinced that was the case. But demographically, things have really changed. So I just saw the way in which, you know, Stockholm in particular was just becoming browner. And I said, you know, what I didn't understand, like, how that was happening or what was happening, and, you know, how immigration had been working, and how people were thinking about difference in particular, right? I wanted to know, you know, what it was like to be a Black person in Swedish. How did people think about Blackness? Like, what is its, you know, how is Blackness separate from Africanness, right, in Sweden? Or, you know, how is it, and at this time, it's also a time period in which, like, American culture, right, is just becoming hegemonic in Sweden, right? And African American culture is a part of that. So there was a way in which people had a kind of familiarity with African American culture and music and television, you know, for example. But that was separate, right, from their relation to the Black people, right, that were living among them. So I said, you know what, I really need to know more about this. In particular, after we had children, and I was like, these kids are Black and Swedish, right? What does that mean for them, right? And what are the ways in which we are kind of apprehended in this culture, right? I wanted to know more about that. And I realized that some of the tools that I had as a kind of critical race studies scholar here in the U.S. Were useful in understanding that, and some of them were not, right? So I was like, oh, there's a whole other discourse happening here, right? It's got some historical, it's got a history, right? And it also has a kind of really contemporary version that even Swedes themselves, kind of Black and white, or, you know, mixed race Swedes or adopted Swedes, that everyone is trying to work out, right? So I entered into that conversation at a really important moment for Sweden, which was just random and fantastic, right? So you know, Black Swedes talk about whether or not they have a community, right? And what I'm trying to think about as I follow the work and the kind of culture that they're making is the ways in which they're constructing that community, and they're constructing it around, again, in relationship to my other work, I think they're constructing it around a kind of otherwise blackness, right? A blackness that isn't necessarily one that has roots in colonialism and imperialism and slave trade. It's not only that, right? It's also a blackness that is not a kind of displaced Africanness, right? Because a lot of people come from various parts of Africa, including the Horn of Africa, which is the most common identity, right? But it's some negotiation of those things that have to do with also very specific Swedish circumstances that are about a kind of a real desire for colorblindness, a real desire for a real, what Swedes themselves called a kind of norm of whiteness, a real kind of lack of rhetoric about race, and a denial that exists. Right, so all of these things are kind of coming together in the way that the Swedish community is thinking about itself and also making art in relationship to its identity, but also into Swedishness. So I became really interested in that.
And let's talk a little bit about community. One thing that really fascinates me about your work is that you're really involved, or you know a lot of like Swedish bloggers and natural hair bloggers. And
yes.
It's interesting to think about the internet and social media as a race-making tool. And could you talk a little bit more about the role of the internet and social media and community building?
Yeah. This has
Swedes?
been a really, really unexpected part of the work that I'm doing, because I partly work with a group of artists who are actors and directors and musicians, right? Producers, right? People who are involved in kind of, material art making, right? Performance artists, right? Who are on stages and in cultural spaces, right? But I realized that some of the most interesting thinking, right, about race and blackness and difference in Sweden are young people, so people in their 20s who have social media platforms, right? Some of whom have platforms that are specifically designed to talk about non-white identity, right? Some of whom have other platforms that are initially designed to talk about microaggressions, right? Another woman who started a platform that was really about kind of highlighting fashion and like black fashion and dress, right? So these kind of younger people who are really social media savvy, right, are creating these spaces that are really, really important because for the formation of communities, because people feel very isolated, right? There are communities of, say, Somalis or Eritreans or Gambians, but the younger people, so the second generation of those communities, also feel themselves to be very Swedish, right? So they're interested in having a conversation about Black Swedishness, right? And those conversations are happening more and more online, right? And one of the most successful sites in Sweden started as it's called Black Coffee, and it was started as simply a meetup, right? It was sort of like, let's be 20 people and go into a cafe and have coffee and meet each other. Like, let's meet, right? They eventually added a kind of conscience raising to that work, and then politics to that work, and they organized demonstrations against racism and racist acts, as well as had very deep and difficult conversations, right, about identities they shared and identities they don't share, right? So that was all happening on Facebook, right? There are Instagram platforms, and then so these. I feel like social media is a really fascinating community making tool, right? The tools are used like any tool, right? For some good work, right? In terms of connecting people and getting conversations started, and also in the Swedish example in particular, having conversations in what they call separatist spaces, right? There aren't that many Black Swedes. They often find that their anti-racist work is very dominated. Can be dominated by white voices. So they needed spaces where they could do this work and have these conversations that were separate which were very controversial, but nevertheless they did it, and they're doing it. So these spaces are incredibly important. They also, what's fascinating to me is they also, they don't necessarily last for long because there are conflicts, right? So they're important spaces because they're allowing for discussion, they're allowing for disagreement. Sometimes those disagreements become really difficult and they don't last, right? But they do really important work in terms of providing a tool and nodes and moments, right? For working all of this out, right? Or for at least getting the issues on the table. And it seemed to me it's completely transformed the community. I'm using scare quotes. The community in Sweden, because people found each other, and that finding has made all the difference in terms of how people feel like what kinds of expression they can have.
So how has being a scholar of fashion and visual culture changed how you dress and see yourself?
That is like the $1 million question. Because whenever you start writing about fashion and dress, you do feel a certain responsibility. I mean, it's a responsibility in two ways. One, to show up in something, either in something that's like befitting what you're talking about, or not, right? I mean, and it's like you have to make a deliberate choice. Am I going for it this time, right? Or am I actually going to be the kind of blank slate against which the work does its work, right? I have to say that when I was interviewing for jobs right out of grad school, I walked into an interview. There were 12 people around a table, and the first thing that they said to me was, "Oh, we wondered what you would be wearing," and I was like, "I'm wearing a cheap suit from the Limited." Right? So that was a real, yeah. I mean, and then it was at that moment that I realized, oh, this is going to be a thing, right? So here's how I think about it. It has changed how I do it, and over the years it's also changed in terms of just how much time I have to devote to any fashion, right? I mean, I've had kids and trying to kind of just keep my life above water, so it has changed in terms of I'm now committed more or less to a relatively neutral palette, right? with some kind of like really serious color, right? I mean, that's just like what I've come down to. I also started a couple years ago, wearing dresses because it's a one choice. It's a one choice in the morning, right? It's like, oh, I need that one, right? It's not like I need these 5 pieces and let me put them together. It's like that one, right? So that's become easier. Yeah, and I also, here's the other thing I say, that even when I'm just, bringing in a pair of jeans, right, I do try to kind of keep up with what's going on, both in terms of, street fashion and like right now it's Fashion Week, right? So I look to see what's going on, right? So I follow that stuff. So even if I'm not bringing it physically, I'm bringing the knowledge, right? which is important. So and that's also the fun thing. Like my best. Everybody procrastinates at their desk, right? My procrastination includes, legitimately, I believe, right, a certain run through certain fashion blogs and other places. So that brings me pleasure, right? So I'm excited about that. So it's changed it in terms of like I think about it more, and then I decided to think about it less. And that was important. I also have certain colleagues that I really admire in terms of the way that they handle their public presentation. Christina Sharp, who teaches at Tufts, has this she is all like on the Janelle Monáe track, where it's black and white with usually some amazing piece of jewelry, right? And I admire, like, she comes, she looks good every time. It's crisp, it's fresh. She doesn't look like a waiter, right? And she's just always bringing, like, I really admire her style. So sometimes I think about like other people who are working in a relatively limited color palette, right? But who are doing that in a fierce way, right? So I have some people out there that I think about when I'm getting dressed.
And so you mentioned a neutral color palette. Do you think that's related to Sweden influencing your sense of style?
I think weirdly enough, like I am, and maybe this is the New England in me, right? I feel like I've always been something of a minimalist, right? So my own aesthetic had to do with, I think, has always been somewhat minimalist, so that like it met the Scandinavian well, right? In terms of that, so that would have been my natural, that would have been my natural kind of home decoration in any case, right? So that was a nice mix, and I do feel like, I mean, Swedish dressing is Sweden is a very consensus culture in terms of fashion, right? H&M turns things around pretty quickly, but the part of Swedish fashion that's not fast fashion is very neutral tones, very kind of classic pieces. It's extremely minimalist, like in its best form. Some people think it's boring, right? It makes sense to me, right? And it seems like it's not necessarily designed to be totally comfortable, but there is a kind of comfort around it. One of the things that is interesting to me about Stockholm as the place, right, is that for me is that the clothing is very neutrally colored, right? But Stockholm is actually a really colorful place, like architecturally, weirdly enough, right? So so there's this way in which there's like a kind of play between, what people are wearing and the places that they're in, right? So that's kind of interesting to me, and something I appreciate when I'm there. So yes, I think it's true, but I also find myself, as somebody who spends a lot of time looking at Black people and what they're wearing, as becoming anxious sometimes about the lack of color, right? And wanting that thing that is the brightest thing I could possibly find, so I feel like it's a little bit of a tug back and forth, and I feel like that's the truth of the life that I'm living. So but I've also been interested in how Black people are again like kind of communicating Black Swedish people are communicating with their fashion, right? They also are really interested in this kind of like neutral base that has a kind of color like infused within it, right? So there's a lot of like kind of very subtle kind of mixing of pattern and color there, or a completely beige outfit with a fantastic head wrap. There's a lot of like kind of attempts to kind of mash up, or like the subtle like a very subtle jewelry that would have a kind of kind of African or African American reference, right? So the way that Black Swedes handle that, if they're interested in it, is a kind of beautiful thing to me.
That's fascinating. I wonder if there's a way that we could talk about aesthetics with racial politics. Yeah. So how do you think this sort of the Scandinavian minimalism sort of glosses over like a history or like a race neutral politics, or actually how the minimalism reflects what they think is sort of a progressive society?
That's really important question, and there are a couple of art historians in particular in Sweden who have been working on that question, like thinking about whiteness, right? Swedish whiteness, not just as a kind of category of identity, but the ways in which the kind of like reverential whiteness seeps into aesthetics, right? So there's a great book by an art historian out of Gothenburg who talks about the relationship of this of color blindness, right, to Swedish aesthetics and minimalism, and really sees it as something that is not race neutral in any way, and really talks about when Sweden became white, and then the whitest of white, right, and then the way that seeps into design practices. Minimalist design practices. If you go into Swedish homes now, the interior, the most popular, it's getting a little bit different, but for the last 10 years or so, Swedish interiors are entirely white. You walk into houses that have white walls, white furniture, white carpets, white, it's just white. And I when I first, I was like, what is this about? And actually, Swedish comedians, there's a great comedian duo who used to be interior designers. They have a piece about, like an hour-long piece about the whiteness of Swedish homes.
Wow.
That talks about purity, but not in a racial frame, right? Which is also interesting to me, right? So there is this. It's also about the light. I mean, to be honest, like there's a real way in which you need to bring light inside because it's not happening outside for a large part of the year. So there's this kind of very interesting relationship between Swedish racial ideologies, which come out of, they did have a eugenics program. That was about kind of purity and streamlining and practicality, and between minimalist design, right, and minimalist design that interestingly was designed like IKEA, right, minimalist design that was designed also to be for everyone, right, but the everyone was pretty clearly defined, right, minimalist designed, white interior, right. There's absolutely a kind of racial narrative within that people are just really starting to explore in those terms. So that work has been really useful to me and a kind of excellent reminder.
Well, this has been so much fun. I've really enjoyed our conversation. I learned so much. But before we part, can I ask you a series of rapid-fire questions?
Yes.
So what's on the essential Monica Miller syllabus? What books encapsulate who you are?
This was such a hard question. And I thought it was fascinating that when I thought about it, my instinct was about fiction, right? I mean, I'm trained as a literature scholar. Initially, I do other work now, but I immediately went to the books that I would carry with me no matter where I was. So here they are, and it's not a complete list, but it's a kind of historical list, right? I would start with Du Bois, Souls of Black Folk, and also his novel Dark Princess, which I read about. I would have Nella Larson, because I find the kind of, now she's important to me because of some of the things she says about Denmark, but also just the intimate way that she writes about kind of race, self-presentation, and femininity and sexuality seems like just really, I mean, she's got 100 pages there, and it's a world, right? Toni Morrison's Beloved is a book I just don't leave home without ever. I find the last part of that book which is the kind of poem about the Middle Passage and motherhood and generations, to be the kind of most beautiful piece of writing ever. Invisible Man I take with me all the time because of Ellison, and because of the way that Ellison describes what it means to be a black person in a white world, and also the way in which he describes like black communities self-sustaining in that book at the same time. I'm grateful to him for that. James Baldwin, I don't have to say much about that, right? But I do say it's James Baldwin's novels, right? I read all of the novels actually before I read any essays, and Just Above My Head and Giovanni's Room were so important to me in terms of thinking about like intimate portraits of black interiority, right? And the complicatedness of that. The way in which black people are complicated, right? I mean, that I find his work to be just kind of unparalleled in that way. They're novels that are full of feeling and intelligence, but in some ways the intellectualism comes through the feeling, and that seems something I would never want to leave home without. And the last two are kind of things I've been thinking about recently. So I would take Americana, Chimamanda's book, not because I love all of it, but because there's important stuff in there about blackness in a global frame, right? I would also take Zadie Smith, who I love and struggle with, right? So I want them together because I think they're having a conversation that is one for the 21st century, right? Again, in terms of thinking about how blackness moves and changes and is inflected with gender and sexuality. They're not writing explicitly about that, but it's there, right? I find those books to be really good kind of touchstones of how we need to think outside of an American frame.
And what's your favorite word in Swedish?
My favorite word in Swedish is a little of a controversy. It's helskotta, which is a little bit of a. It's not really a swear, but it means like kind of wheelbarrow from hell, right? And the reason why it's my favorite is because whenever my husband says it when he's angry, it makes me laugh. So if he's angry and he says, "Well, helskotta," I just start laughing, and then the whole thing is diffused. So it's my favorite. It's my favorite word. It's like an old. It's like kind of G. Willikers, but like in a bad way. It's just super funny. I mean, sorry.
And what's your favorite word in English?
My favorite word in English has always been lugubrious.
Oh, interesting.
I know.
Oh.
Yeah, I know. Because I just love the way my mouth moves when I say it. Even though it's like, I know that it's a sad word, right? But I think it tastes like ice cream.
Do you have a favorite article of clothing?
The scarf.
The scarf.
I feel like the scarf can save you, right? You can put a scarf on something and it just elevates it, right? It's also like, I don't like to be cold, right? So like either the kind of silk scarf or the wool scarf. Like I always need a scarf. Yeah, it's also like an easy design element. You can just like completely, change something
right
with a scarf.
Yeah, completely transform an outfit.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what's your favorite place in New York?
My favorite place in New York inside is the Studio Museum, actually. I love the Studio Museum. I'm so glad it's there. I'm glad it's close by. I can walk to it. I just like everything that they're doing, right? I mean, in terms of like what they present me with something new to think about kind of all the time. I can't wait for them to have more space. I love their artist in residence program, right? I did an event with one of their artists recently. It's just, I feel I couldn't have imagined when I was growing up that I would live within walking distance of a place like that.
And what's your favorite place in Sweden?
My favorite place in Sweden is actually a street in the neighborhood we normally stay in, which is in the southern part of Stockholm. It's a street called Katarinavägen, which is a street along a kind of hill. And when you're standing on Katarinavägen, you can see all of Stockholm from the south. It's just the most beautiful view. And a couple of years ago, we were living very, very close to that street, and I got to walk there every day, and it was just. It's hard to describe what it means to look at Stockholm from that street on a summer evening. It's just so beautiful.
And what are you currently reading?
I'm about to start today, The Hate You Give, right, which my son just read, and I'm going to read it so that we can talk about it. The other book, I'm like right at the beginning of starting books. So the other book I'm about to start is Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, which I haven't read yet, which I feel like I need to read now. And I'm trying to finish a book. I'm going to mess up the title, which is not good. Maybe I shouldn't say it then. I know. I'm going to say I'm trying to finish a book about the Vietnam War called The Sympathizer. It's taken me a long time to read that book, and I don't know why. And I want to dedicate some time to finishing it this weekend.
So what book do you wish you were reading right now?
I have three. One is a very long book called The Goldfinch, which won some awards a couple years ago. It's just really long, and I think it's really wonderful. It's inspired by a painting by Donna Tartt, and I don't want to carry it around. So I wish that I were reading that, but I can't do it because I would carry it around. The other book that is kind of like shouting at me that needs to be read is kind of nerdy book, Akile Mbembe's Critique of Black Reason. This is a book everybody's talking about in some form. I just need to read it. And the other one is a more popular book. Like I saw this one the other day, and it was also yelling at me in the bookstore. Ta-Nehisi Coates' We Were 8 Years in Power. I need to read that. So I wish I was reading all of those books, but I'm not.
So if you had to choose between New York City and Stockholm, what would you choose?
Both.
What about Harvard or Columbia?
I choose Barnard.
Basquiat or Bowie?
I choose Imam.
Well, Monica, this has been so much fun. I could talk to you for another hour, but we're going to end here. Thank you so much for sitting down with me.
Thank you, Jonathan.